Hi guys, we're going to finish up with our last split video for agriculture, and I'm calling this just odds and ends because there's a few things that we need to review and or hit more directly that we haven't done so yet. So I'm just calling this odds and ends, and you're welcome to do so too. To start off the first one, we've alluded to this concept of intensive versus extensive agriculture, but I want to make sure I hit it head on so we understand the difference between these two concepts. Intensive agriculture being a term, let's put that on the left. Intensive agriculture are the types of agriculture where there's a high input of labor and a high output per acre on a small area of land. Let's talk about what that means. If we're talking about, as you see there, rice farming, particularly wet rice farming, which is what's shown there on those rice paddy or wet rice sawas, as it's more formally called. Um, these high inputs of labor means that there is a lot of labor needed on a small area of a land in order to get large output or large yield per acre. So high input of labor and a high output over a very small area of land. Think of it, I mean, in most basic sense, I just think of it if you're working very intensively on a small area of land. So that's going to be intensive agriculture. Key examples, of course, are intensive subsistence agriculture. That's by definition intensive agriculture. Another one would be considered to be market gardening, when you're putting a lot of labor and high output over a very small area of land. So think of that like the production of grapes. I mean, there's going to be a large, not tremendously large space needed, but there is going to be large output of that. But there's also a lot of labor involved in the growing of market gardening, generally speaking. That's in contrast. I want you to think about extensive agriculture as there's a lot of land. So it's almost like if a person had 100, let's say, joules of work. Imagine if an intensive agriculture, all 100 joules of work was going directly into a small area of land, whereas extensive agriculture, you're taking that 100 joules of work and you're spreading it out over a very large area of land. Formal definition, we have a low input of labor and low output per acre over a large area of land. Let's put that into context. If you are a grain farmer, then you have a ton of land that you will be growing grain on, because you're not going to get massive outputs of grain in a small area of land. You need lots and lots of land in order for that grain to become particularly profitable and for you to to become particularly profitable. So extensive agriculture, again, I just think what makes most sense to me is if I think about 100 joules of work, investing a ton of energy, labor in a small area of land for intensive agriculture, whereas ranching and grain farming, the things that you would find on the outermost circle of von Thunen's model, you have an extensive area of land, so you're spreading that labor out across a very large area, as opposed to really hitting hard one particular area of land. Now that's a little bit different than if we were going to compare that to labor intensive. Well, there's also some categories within this. There's also labor intensive agriculture. So you can have intensive agriculture is when you've got high input of labor and high output per acre. One way in which agriculture can be intensive agriculture is if it's labor intensive agriculture, where a whole lot of human work is applied per unit of output. So particularly subsistence agriculture. If we're thinking about as it says on the left, there's labor intensive corn raising. If you're not using large scale industrial agriculture, then the production of that corn is going to be labor intensive. If you think about shifting cultivation, it's tremendously labor intensive. Though, look back at this here. Shifting cultivation is actually going to fall under extensive agriculture, because shifting cultivation, you're moving over a large area of land. You're continuing to move in each step of the way. So if we compare that, I'm going to pause for just 1 second so I can pull up a different graphic. Okay, no dice, couldn't find it, but that's okay. Concept again, just that labor intensive agriculture, you're putting a whole lot of work into a specific area of land. I put the example of subsistence agriculture on that, but you can also consider that dairying, commercial agriculture of dairying, is very labor intensive. Mediterranean agriculture, I would argue, is also labor intensive. That's all. Another way to be intensive is capital intensive agriculture. Capital is the word that just means essentially money for all, and as it says here, large amounts of capital, which I'm defining as equipment and buildings used to produce other goods. So back it up for a second. Capital, if you're saying you need a certain amount of capital to do something, that implies that you need a certain amount of money, a certain amount of infrastructure, a certain amount of buildings, certain amount of really just money to do something. That's what capital means. So if you need a lot of capital in a type of agriculture, then we're talking about large scale commercial agriculture with typically use of biotechnology. So capital intensive agriculture is the idea essentially that you need a large amount of capital the large amount of capital is applied per unit of output. So for each stalk of corn that is produced, there was a large amount of infrastructure, a large amount of money that went into the production of that stalk of corn. Again, we're talking commercialized agriculture. We're talking that there was a tractor that was mechanized that was on the land that this corn was produced, or that there was a very precise irrigation system or watering system used for these crops. So capital intensive agriculture is going to be far more representative of commercial agriculture, or what it evolved from the green revolution technologies. This is the idea again that there's a lot of money and capital and resources that were invested in the production of that particular crop. The example of the picture here is that here's corn exported from a capital-intensive U.S. farm to the Mexican market. So again, large-scale use of biotechnology, large-scale use of pesticides, fertilizers, all kinds of money and capital invested into the production of that good. Okay, we're going to break the analysis questions up a little bit differently for the odds and ends. What I'd like you to do is a part of a review activity here. I'd like you to create the chart here for intensive agriculture, extensive agriculture, labor intensive agriculture, and capital intensive agriculture. And I'd like you to sort all of the terms you see here on the bottom into these different categories. You absolutely can repeat terms because, for example, I just mentioned here that dairying is a capital intensive form of agriculture. It's also a labor intensive form of agriculture, and it's also an intensive form of agriculture in the sense of it's over a smaller area of land. Um, so actually, you know what? Let me back that up. You're better off putting the better example of for dairying would be labor intensive and capital intensive. But point being that you can use in both of those different categories. Um, and there's also ones that could apply in you can make an argument for neither. But what I want you to process here and to work through and is the idea of what is the difference between intensive, extensive, labor intensive, and capital intensive agriculture. So go ahead and pause here and complete that task. And when you're ready, join us for part two. Part two is here, and this actually is an essential question associated with it, which is how is rural land divided and settled? So rural land, the title of this unit is actually agriculture and rural land use. So how is rural land patterned and settled? And we've touched on this in many different fashions, but I want to make sure we directly head on hit exactly how rural land is divided up. Because if you get on a plane in the United States, I'm going to fast forward for a second, then you're going to see you're going to see land that looks like this. You're going to see land that looks like this. Right? And that's not just coincidental, that's not just happenstance. There's a reason behind that. And rural land has been divided up based largely on history of colonial practices. So, a couple terms to get down right off the bat here. First is survey patterns. So, the term survey patterns means the patterns used to survey land. Surveying land, you may have seen people do this before when they have, they usually have cameras set up and they're usually wearing construction uniform attire. That was redundant. And construction uniforms, and they are surveying the land. They're taking pictures of the land. And surveying, generally speaking, means you're recording the information of an area to create a map. In this instance, survey patterns means how land is divided up on a map. And there's many different ways to do this. There's three primary ways that we're going to take a look at. One way of dividing up land, dividing up that rural land and settling on that land, is called the long lot system. And on the long lot system, take a look at the graphic below. Houses are divided, or excuse me, houses are created, erected, they're established. Houses are erected on narrow lots perpendicular to rivers and water. Now, this makes perfect sense if you consider that this survey pattern was created at a time when there were not cars and there was not rail. So in that that therefore means that the rivers and lakes, but particularly rivers, and waterways were the primary means of communication and trade and transportation. So, in turn, if you look at here again at the bottom graphic, then you'll see, I'm just going to point it out here. You'll see that if there's a river right here, then clearly this is prime territory, prime real estate. So the houses would all, that in a long lot system, all the people here all have access to that river. And then you're essentially dividing up the good and bad land. Good land being land close to the river, you've got cropland, you've got pasture, and then the forest, which is not particularly helpful if you were not a farmer. But the idea here, rather than having one person living on forest, one person living on pasture, one person living on cropland, and one person creating or controlling access to the river, that a long lot system maximizes the territory and maximizes the area that each person can use, and that it affords everyone an opportunity to both grow their own crops and ship them out in transportation. Then, so this system was largely used by the French, and this is now sort of the stamp of French colonial territory, what area that was once owned by the French or once controlled by the French. So this right here in the top right is actually a picture of long lots. Try to imagine here these long lots. You can see them again if you look right here. You can see those long lots that are all perpendicularly. I mean, give or take here, perpendicularly divided up. Now, when there's the river bends like this, you see that the long lots sort of fan out here. Um, Almost, how do you describe that? Like I'm envisioning the protractor when you got the bend here. That the long lots are still all divided up and they're fanning out, but you can see at the top here where you get the true perpendicular long lot. The idea here is that this was designed to give everybody some of the best land, like I just said. But the problem is that rivers move. And when rivers move, then this long lot system is going to be thrown off. And what is now prime territory may no longer even exist as prime territory. So that system is used. You can see that here's another better picture of the long lot system. It's really the cultural imprint of French colonial rule. In Canada, in Detroit, in areas of Indiana, in Louisiana, you still to this day see this long lot system. You still see, if you're, this is an aerial view, you can see that that's how the land is divided up. And this is a representative of the former French colonial rule of these territories. Another system that was mostly used by the English and the British, or the English and the British, English, same thing here. Um, and they're both in England as well as within the colonial territories in the early parts of the colonial history, and that's an important differentiation which we'll get to. This system is called the meets and bounds pattern, which actually literally just means measurements and boundaries. What this is rather than the long lot system, which was a kind of a pattern, a systematic pattern you see here, that this was all divided into very common territory size. This is using the physical geography and physical features of the local geography to actually create boundaries. So this sounds a little silly to describe in this way, but this really would be something like, well, I own from this chestnut tree to this bend in the river, and when the road takes that turn near the pine, I'm referencing things that are up here, the pine tree, then you walk due north for 100 paces to the black oak tree. I mean, this is literally that you would use the natural features of the area to create the boundaries of the land. And so this system was common in England and was brought over to North America. And when it was brought over to North America, that this time in the early 1700s, the eastern part of the United States, where they were, this is their 13 colonies era, and slowly, gradually thereof, growing thereof. But in the what was the 13 colonies, which is now generally speaking the Boswash corridor, you see these meets and bounds systems, and it's very irregular. I mean, you compare the meets and bounds to the very systematized pattern of the long lot system, and you see this is tremendously different. So this has led to very irregular settlement patterns in the U.S., that there's no systematized way in which the U.S. land is surveyed or is divided in the eastern seaboard. In contrast, or I'm sorry, not in contrast, in addition, rivers, lakes, and trees, these all things all change. And again, natural boundaries don't always serve as effective boundaries. We talked about that in the political geography unit. So if a natural boundary changes, then the meets and bounds system is less effective. So again, in modern times, we're not. It's no longer discussed as we no longer necessarily use the chestnut tree or the pine tree as the definition of one land versus one territory versus another, or one piece of land versus another. But bottom line is just that this was the origins, and this is why the Eastern Seaboard has a much less regular, a much less uniform land survey pattern. Now, in direct contrast, most of the Midwest and Western part of the United States, which was settled later than the Eastern part of the United States, actually, let me change that phrasing. It was settled way earlier by the Native Americans, but the white settlement that followed after Manifest Destiny was in the western part of the United States, and therefore this land survey pattern looks very different. It's actually based upon this system that's called the township and range system. So the township and range system is very uniform. The word uniform means same. So let's think of your school uniforms. They are same. The township and range system is very uniform. Land is divided into 6 square mile blocks. That's called the township. You can see that here in the blue. And then that is then therefore divided in, oh, excuse me, that's that the survey lines. Let me back that up. This one here, the township, you can see are those green smaller box. And this graphic, it says 36 square miles. This was relevant to a very specific place, but I just wanted to show you. I thought this graphic was easy to see. Then that township is then divided into 1 square mile blocks, which is the range, and then the ranges are then sold off to individual people. So what this leads to, so the township and range primarily came out of what after the United States had our after the United States bought the Louisiana Purchase, and that opened up a tremendous amount of territory in the West. And the township and actually was further the settlement of the West in the township and range program system was further used after what was called the 1862 Homestead Act that really encouraged um, English settlers, but they're now soon to be American citizens, to go west and settle the West. And what that resulted in is a pattern that you see now. This is if you have flown over the Midwest, then you're familiar with this aerial view where you see a very very uniform and systematized pattern that's called the township and range system. So that's another settlement pattern of rural United States, of rural land in the United States. So if you see here, this is the area of the U.S. So the meets and bounds states you see are the darker green, and then the rectangular. It says here rectangular system. That's the township and range system. You can see the vast majority of the United States practices the the township and range model, which is a product primarily of the fact that the areas in the green are the ones that were settled initially when the United States was still a British colony, somewhat, with Texas being some kind of an exception in that sense. But we'll get there in U.S. history. Um, but then you see the majority is really the township and range developments. That's why the United States looks the way it does. Here's analysis question number 2. Two, how are land survey patterns a reflection of colonialism? And there's a bonus point option here. If you can use in your response the term that we used, that's used to describe the fact that each society, I'm sorry, typo again, that the land that land over time, geez Louise, that each society over time leaves an imprint upon the land. So the idea here that over a successive period of time, the land will start looking one way, and then each successive group will shape it in some way. If you can effectively A, remember that term, and B, utilize it in your response, that would be one bonus point. Number 3, I want to clarify is which land survey pattern is used in the Corn Belt and the Salad Bowl. So the Corn Belt you should know by now, but there's a sample picture on the top right. Ignore that Jordan Family Farm. I just wanted to use the graphic. That area that's where most of the corn and many soybeans are grown in the United States. And then the bottom left, you should be able to identify that state. I'm not going to even bother, but you can see there that that's the Salad Bowl. That's a key agricultural region in the United States where much of the lettuce and market gardening of the West occurs. So which survey land pattern is used in those areas? And you must use the map I just showed you to answer that question. All right, now talking about One more thing is we're talking about rural land patterns is where people settle. So we just discussed different ways in which. So you can see right there, that's a picture, the ways in which land is divided. And you can see right there that that's a picture of the township and range settlement pattern. The type of agriculture that a place practices also affects where people live, where they settle. More specifically, the intensity of crop cultivation affects the density of housing. To understand what I just said, you got to review those definitions of intensive and extensive agriculture. I'm going to say that again now, keeping in mind those definitions. The intensity of crop cultivation, so how intense the agriculture is, affects the density of housing and where it is that people actually live. In extensive agriculture, where we're using a large area of land, low amount of labor over a large area of land, or low labor inputs over a large area of land. Let me phrase it that way. I don't mean to imply that extensive agriculture doesn't require a lot of work. Rather, just extensive agriculture, the work is spread out over a large area of land with less agricultural output in each area of land. In extensive agriculture, housing is dispersed. The farmers tend to live on individual farms and are largely isolated from their neighbors. Now, which is what's demonstrated in the top right hand corner. Now, this makes sense again if we connect it back to what's written at the top, that the intensity of the crop cultivation affects the density of housing. If you're practicing a type of agriculture that requires a large area of land and low labor over that large area of land, then the housing is likely going to be more dispersed. And one person and one family or one group is going to be responsible for that large area of land. Now, in contrast, intensive agriculture has intensive labor needs. So, therefore, people tend to live closer together because then, as a team, as a group, as a village, then the entire village is then responsible for those inputs of labor. So if the entire village is practicing, say, wet rice farming, then the village is going to likely live close together with surrounding smaller fields so that the entire group will then exert that labor that's necessary on that area of land. If you need more labor, then it makes more sense for people to live closer together to work that labor on a small area of land. What that's called is that often leads to nucleated settlements, which you see on the bottom right hand corner. Um, the nucleated settlements is defined here that houses are clustered close together on a central point, crossroads, water supply, or market or place. In this instance, for rural land use, that graphic is a little bit more relevant to suburban or to, well, actually, I mean, it's all land use, but um, the nucleated settlement in this instance, where villages are very close together with the small surrounding fields. And it makes sense if you consider that like the nuclei. The village is the nuclei, and the entire the surrounding area are the farms that they live on and they work on. Here's a picture of this. A nucleated settlement is going to be have all of that. There's going to be some sort of town or village, depending on how many people live there, and then you can see that the farmland surrounding that. And this also makes it easier to provide services in a rural area. Services being things like schools, like hospitals, or medical care, I should say. Hospitals would be for a larger area. Um, Food, I mean, for one another, marketplaces. So a nucleated settlement in a rural area is often a reflection of either intensive agriculture or um, or a small group of people. So, in your own words, explain why these settlements are more dispersed in areas that practice extensive agriculture and why settlements are more clustered in areas that practice intensive agriculture. All right, that does it for us, guys. That is the agriculture unit.